When you're dealing with someone who's narcissistic, the first thing you have to understand is that their control doesn't begin with overt dominance. It rarely starts as tyranny. It begins as charm. That's the hook, and it's often dressed in something that appears benign, even noble. Concern. This is what makes it so deceptive. It looks like they care. They present suggestions as helpful advice, critiques as constructive feedback, rules as a form of protection. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not anchored in your own values, you'll mistake this manipulation for love. You see, a narcissist doesn't lead with force, they lead with illusion. And one of the most powerful illusions they cast is the idea that they are looking out for you. But here's the psychological twist. They're not protecting you. They're trying to dominate you. The mask of concern becomes the mechanism of control. Now, this isn't always easy to spot, because at first, their influence can even feel reassuring. It feels like stability. It feels like guidance. It feels like someone finally sees you, finally wants to help you become your best self. But dig a little deeper, and you'll see it's not really about your growth. It's about their comfort. Your freedom is a threat to their ego. Your independence is an affront to their need for relevance. So the concern morphs into correction, and the correction morphs into domination. It happens subtly. One day they suggest you stop talking to a certain friend because they're bad for your energy. Another day they imply that your dreams are unrealistic. I'm just being honest. And soon enough, you're second-guessing yourself. Not because they've placed themselves in the seat of your internal compass. This is where the trap tightens, because narcissistic control doesn't scream. It whispers. It builds its power not by direct confrontation, but by quiet erosion. You don't notice it at first because it's incremental, and that's the whole strategy. Control by inches, authority by implication. One micro-concession at a time until you're standing in a life you don't recognize and a self you no longer feel connected to. The philosophical underpinning of this behavior is rooted in the narcissist's deep fear of irrelevance. They cannot coexist with the autonomy of others because your autonomy reminds them of their lack of control, and that is intolerable to them. They need your dependence to validate their sense of superiority. Your need for them is their illusion of power. So the moment you start thinking for yourself, feeling confident without their approval or setting boundaries, it's perceived not as growth, but as betrayal. That's why it's crucial, vital, really, that you develop the ability to recognize the pattern. You need to be able to say, this isn't care, this is control, wearing the costume of compassion. Once you can name it, you begin to break its hold. Once you can see it clearly, you reclaim the choice that was slowly being taken from you. Now, to do that effectively, you must cultivate discernment, not cynicism, not paranoia, but genuine discernment. This means you observe not only what people say, but how it affects your sense of self. Real support strengthens you. It makes you more capable, more grounded. False support, manipulation, diminishes you. It creates doubt, dependency, and a low-grade anxiety that keeps you psychologically tethered. One of the most telling signs that you're dealing with narcissistic control is that you begin to feel like you're constantly apologizing for who you are. You're always too much or not enough, and the bar is always moving. That's not love. That's emotional subjugation. And the reason they do it is because it keeps you focused on earning their approval instead of recognizing that you never needed it in the first place. This is not just a personal dynamic, it's a philosophical dilemma. It's the ancient question of freedom versus control, of truth versus illusion. And the narcissist always bets that you'll choose the comfort of illusion over the pain of truth. And the only way you beat them at their own game is by proving that you value your sovereignty more than their validation. So what do you do when you sense this happening? You slow down, you listen, not just to their words, but to your own body's response. If every interaction leaves you more confused, more anxious, more unsure of yourself, that's a clue. Not everything that feels good is good. And not everything that feels bad is wrong. Discomfort is often the birthplace of clarity. And then, this is the hard part, you have to name the truth out loud, not necessarily to them, but to yourself. You say, this isn't care, this is coercion, and I choose not to submit. That moment, when you name what's really happening, is the moment you take back your agency. You'll know you're growing when their concerns start sounding less like wisdom and more like a warning. Not because you've become cold or hard or defensive, but because you've stopped mistaking control for connection. And that, in the end, is the only power a narcissist truly fears, your ability to see them clearly. When a narcissist attempts to control you, one of the most powerful responses, perhaps the most threatening to their carefully constructed world, is not rage or retaliation, but calm detachment. It's your stillness, your refusal to play their game, because at the root of their behavior is a desperate craving for reaction. That's the lifeblood of their control. If they can trigger you, if they can provoke you into justifying yourself, defending yourself, explaining yourself, then they've already won half the battle. You're on their field. You've accepted the unspoken terms of their psychological warfare. But what happens when you refuse to play? That's the deeper question here. See, most people think the way to beat control is by fighting it head on. But what they fail to understand is that narcissists thrive on conflict just as much as they do on charm. They feed off emotional chaos. Whether it's positive or negative doesn't matter, because any engagement is validation. Your emotional investment is the proof that they matter. It's the mirror they need to see themselves. So when you meet their manipulations with fiery resistance, you're still giving them something. You're still locked in their frame. But indifference, that's different. Silence, not passive silence, but intentional grounded silence, shakes them at the core. Because what it signals is this: you no longer have authority here. And that's terrifying for someone who's built their identity around the ability to shape and dominate the emotional climate of others. It's not just about ego, it's about existence. A narcissist without control is a narcissist in crisis, because the illusion starts to unravel, and what lies beneath that illusion is often a very insecure, hollow sense of self that cannot withstand disconnection. So what does calm detachment actually look like in real time? It looks like not reacting when they push your buttons. It looks like hearing their manipulations, their accusations, their attempts to guilt you, and not taking the bait. It means you no longer rush in to defend yourself every time they rewrite reality to suit their narrative. You begin to see it for what it is, a performance. And once you see the performance, it loses its grip. Now, this is not to say that calm detachment is easy. It's not. In fact, it might be one of the hardest disciplines to develop, especially if you've been conditioned over years or even decades to believe that your worth depends on keeping the peace, being understood, being liked. But the truth is, you don't owe anyone your reactivity, and you certainly don't owe it to someone who's using your emotions against you. Psychologically speaking, what you're doing when you detach is reclaiming your internal locus of control. That's a concept from personality psychology. Essentially refers to whether you believe your outcomes in life are driven by your own actions or by external forces. Narcissists need you to live externally. They need you to believe that your peace, your self-worth, your identity all depend on them. But when you step into detachment, you're saying, no, I govern myself. I choose how I respond. I choose what enters my mind and spirit. And that's an existential threat to someone who built their whole persona on being the axis around which others revolve. There's something else here too, something deeper. Calm detachment is not just a strategy, it's a philosophy. It's the embodiment of the idea that you do not have to be pulled into every storm that passes by, that you can remain grounded even as someone else tries to spin you into confusion. It's a kind of quiet strength that says, I know who I am, and I will not let your chaos become my compass. This is a point of spiritual maturity as well, because there's a temptation to make your boundary a weapon, to turn detachment into a form of silent punishment. But that's not true detachment. That's disguised resentment. True detachment isn't free to seek to hurt the other. It simply refuses to be. And when you reach that place, when you can look at the narcissist's attempts to provoke you and feel nothing, that's when the dynamic changes completely. You're no longer caught in their web. You're standing outside of it, watching it for what it is. And from that vantage point, you can finally make choices that serve your long-term well-being, not just your immediate need for relief or validation. What you'll often find is that once you stop feeding the narcissist with reactions, they escalate at first. They push harder. They get louder because they're scrambling to reassert control. But if you stay steady, if you hold your center, that's when the mask slips. That's when they begin to realize they've lost something they can't easily replace. Someone who used to dance to their tune without question. So you don't need to argue. You don't need to explain. You don't need to get louder. You just need to stop dancing. What's most misunderstood about narcissistic control is how covert and psychological it often is. It's not always about yelling or overt manipulation. Sometimes it's subtler. It's the way they rewrite history mid-conversation, the way they shift blame with surgical precision, the way they ask questions that aren't really questions at all, but disguised judgments. These are micro-controls, the invisible threads that tie people to the narcissist version of reality. And one of the most effective ways to cut those threads is to stop justifying yourself. Now, this is important because people who end up in the orbit of narcissists are usually not weak. On the contrary, they tend to be conscientious, emotionally intelligent, often high in empathy and insight. But it's precisely those traits that the narcissist exploits. They know you care about being fair, about being understood, about not being misunderstood. So they use your conscience as a lever. They provoke, twist, accuse, and you, being the self-reflective person you are, respond by explaining, by clarifying, by justifying. But here's the catch. Narcissists aren't seeking understanding. They're seeking submission. Every time you feel the impulse to explain yourself to someone who's not operating in good faith, you're stepping into their frame. You're treating their distortion of the truth as if it's worthy of engagement. And in doing so, you validate the very lie they're selling. This is one of the more psychologically painful realizations because it challenges a deeply human impulse, the need to be seen as good and reasonable. But once you recognize that this need is being weaponized against you, you start to see the trap. And the only way out is to stop playing the game. You see, in healthy dialogue, explanation is a bridge. You explain because you want to connect, to share, to build mutual understanding. But in narcissistic dynamics, explanation becomes a cage. You find yourself rehearsing justifications not because the other person is curious or open-minded, but because they're looking for a flaw in your argument, some emotional loophole they can exploit to drag you back into submission. That's the psychological game. If they can make you doubt your perception, they can control your decisions. And so every time you explain yourself to them, you're unconsciously agreeing that they are the judge, the arbiter of truth. But they're not. Not morally, not psychologically, and certainly not spiritually. And so the shift that needs to happen is not just behavioral, it's philosophical. You have to fundamentally change your relationship to self-explanation. You must move from, I need you to understand why I did this, to, I know why I did this, and that's enough. Now, some will say, but that sounds arrogant. Isn't it prideful not to explain yourself? And that's a valid question. But the answer lies in motive. If your silence comes from contempt, yes, it becomes pride. But if your silence comes from clarity, if it comes from knowing you are no longer willing to debate your sanity with someone who profits from your confusion, then it's not pride, it's protection, it's discernment. Psychologically, what you're doing here is shifting from an external to an internal validation system. Narcissists operate externally. They need others to reflect back a carefully constructed image of power, superiority, and control. But once you shift inward, once your conscience becomes your guide instead of their approval, then they lose access. They can't reach you anymore. Not really. Because they're shouting through a closed door. And ironically, that's when their panic sets in. Because what they fear more than confrontation is irrelevance. As long as you're explaining, you're still engaged. You're still acknowledging them as a central figure in your story. But when you stop explaining, when you let your actions speak and allow your silence to stand, you remove them from the center. You reposition yourself as the author of your own life. And you begin to see something remarkable. You never needed their understanding to do what's right. You never needed their permission to make a decision. You only needed the strength to stop negotiating with someone who has no intention of seeing you clearly. This is a turning point. It's not loud. It doesn't come with dramatic confrontation. Often it comes quietly in a moment of reflection when you realize that explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a form of self-betrayal. And from that moment on, you begin to choose a different path, one where your peace is non-negotiable. So if you find yourself caught in a loop of defending, justifying, pleading, pause. Ask yourself, who am I trying to convince and why? If the answer reveals a pattern of diminishing your truth to fit someone else's distortion, then maybe it's time to let your silence speak. When dealing with narcissistic control, one of the most disarming yet transformative actions you can take is to stop reacting emotionally. That might seem counterintuitive at first. After all, emotions are human, natural, and in healthy relationships, they're a key part of communication. But the key phrase here is healthy relationships. Narcissistic dynamics are not built on mutual respect or empathy. They are structured around dominance, manipulation, and control. And in that kind of environment, your emotional responses become ammunition. A narcissist doesn't necessarily want you to feel good or bad. They want you to feel what keeps them in control. If you're sad, they may offer false comfort to draw you closer. If you're angry, they may provoke further so they can shift the blame and frame themselves as the victim. If you're confused, they'll double down on that fog because confusion weakens resistance. The moment you react emotionally, they know where to steer the ship. Not because your emotions are wrong, but because they become tools in the narcissist's psychological game. So what happens when you stop reacting? Well, first, you interrupt the script. You see, narcissists operate from a very rehearsed psychological pattern. They push, you react, they guilt trip, you apologize, they triangulate, you compete for their approval. It's a dance. And when you stop reacting, when you choose grounded presence over reactivity, they lose the rhythm. It's like trying to play chess with someone who suddenly left the board. The game collapses. But let's be clear, this isn't about becoming numb or emotionally dead inside. That's not strength. That's trauma. This is about cultivating a kind of emotional discipline that allows you to witness what's happening without being swept away by it. It's about learning to pause, to observe, and to choose your response consciously rather than react impulsively. And there's a profound psychological reason why this works. Because when you stop reacting, you stop reinforcing. In behavioral psychology, we know that what gets rewarded gets repeated. So if every time the narcissist criticizes you, you respond defensively, they learn, this works. I've got control. If every time they threaten to withdraw affection, you panic and chase, they learn that threat works. But if their jabs are met with calm neutrality, if their provocations land in silence or a steady gaze, they get nothing back, no fuel, no reinforcement, and over time they start to unravel. This doesn't mean they'll go quietly. In fact, often they'll escalate first. That's important to understand. Because emotional detachment feels like abandonment to the narcissist. And abandonment is their deepest fear. Not because they value you in a deep connected sense, but because they fear losing the validation you provide. So, when you stop reacting, they may lash out harder. They'll poke until they find a weak spot. And that's the moment you must hold the line. The ability to hold your emotional center in the face of manipulation is not just a tactic, it's a transformation. It's the moment you reclaim authorship over your internal state. You stop being a puppet pulled by invisible strings and become something far more formidable. A sovereign individual. And it's terrifying to someone who built their power on your emotional compliance. It's worth noting here that this path demands a great deal of self-awareness because narcissistic control often taps into unresolved wounds, old insecurities, attachment injuries, subconscious beliefs about worth and love. And so to stop reacting emotionally, you must do the inner work. You must explore where your reactivity comes from and build the kind of self-trust that allows you to stand firm in the storm. That's where the philosophical element comes in. Because at its core, this is a question of values. What do you value more? Being understood by someone who refuses to hear you, or being at peace with yourself? Do you value momentary validation or long-term freedom? When you clarify your values, your emotional boundaries become clearer, and with clarity comes strength. This strength doesn't shout. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't perform. It simply is. It's the quiet dignity of someone who knows they cannot be manipulated into a reaction. And that kind of presence, not aggression, not resistance, just presence, is often more unsettling to a narcissist than any confrontation, because it tells them without a single word. And that is devastating to someone who has made your emotional landscape their playground. So the next time a narcissist tries to provoke you, don't think about winning. Think about not playing. Let them throw the bait. Let them monologue, twist, accuse, project, and then just stand there. Breathe. Observe. Choose not to be pulled in, not out of apathy, but out of purpose. When a narcissist tries to control you, one of the most effective and transformative things you can do is to firmly reinforce your personal boundaries. Not once, not twice, but consistently and without apology. And let's be precise about what we mean when we say boundaries, because the word is often thrown around casually, yet its real meaning is deeply psychological, even philosophical. A boundary isn't merely a preference or a request. It's a declaration of where you end and the other person begins. It's the architecture of your identity in relational space. And in the presence of narcissistic manipulation, it's one of the few tools that actually restores your sovereignty. Now, narcissists don't just dislike boundaries, they are fundamentally threatened by them. Why? Because boundaries interfere with their central goal, control. Control over the narrative, control over your emotions, control over how much of yourself you're allowed to keep for yourself. And so when you begin to enforce a boundary, especially one they've previously crossed with impunity, it disrupts their system of power. It reasserts that you are not simply a reflection of their will, but an autonomous individual capable of self-determination. But here's where it gets difficult. Narcissists are not oblivious. They are highly attuned to shifts in the power dynamic. So the moment you begin to say no, to decline, to be baited, to refuse to explain yourself endlessly, to withdraw from the push-pull chaos, they notice. And they often respond not with retreat, but with escalation. They may become charming again, seductive even, offering what looks like reconciliation, or they may become more aggressive, framing your boundary as a betrayal or an attack. This is the psychological trick. They force you to feel guilty for doing something healthy. That's the hallmark of narcissistic influence. Manipulating your conscience until you believe that protecting your well-being is selfish or cruel. And it's in that moment that your resolve must be strongest. Because holding a boundary isn't just an act of self-care. It's a test of your integrity. It's a confrontation between your higher self, the part of you that seeks order, clarity, and peace, and the part that fears rejection, fears chaos, and has learned to overfunction, to avoid it. You see this often in people who've been conditioned to please others, to be agreeable at all costs. They may recognize the need for boundaries intellectually, but emotionally they struggle to hold them when challenged. Why? Because there's a subconscious belief that if they assert themselves, they'll be abandoned or punished. That belief may have roots in early experiences, attachment wounds, family systems where love was conditional on compliance. And narcissists exploit this. They sense it. They push against your boundaries, not just to test your resolve, but to reawaken the emotional scripts that keep you pliable. So what do? You anchor yourself in principle, not emotion, not impulse, but principle. You remind yourself why the boundary exists in the first place. Because when a boundary is rooted in deep self-respect, it becomes unshakable, not aggressive, not defensive, just clear. And that clarity itself becomes a mirror in which the narcissist is forced to see the limits of their influence. For someone who thrives on control, that's a profound loss. It's also important to remember that boundaries are not ultimatums, they're not threats, they're commitments to yourself. And like any commitment, they only have power if you're willing to follow through. If you say, don't speak to me that way, but tolerate it when they do, the boundary evaporates. It becomes performative. And performative boundaries are worse than none at all, because they teach the other person that your words are hollow. True boundaries are enforced with calm consistency, not drama, not rage, but quiet certainty. This isn't easy. There will be moments when you'll be tempted to drop the boundary just to restore peace, just to avoid the discomfort. And in those moments, you must ask yourself, peace at what cost? Because every time you abandon a boundary for the sake of false harmony, you chip away at your self-trust. And self-trust is the foundation of all psychological strength. Without it, you become susceptible to every wave of guilt, every glance of disapproval, every manipulative plea. There's another dimension to this too. When you hold a boundary with a narcissist, you're not just protecting yourself, you're modeling a different kind of relational ethic. You're saying this is what respect looks like, this is what accountability looks like, and whether they can absorb that message or not, it sends a signal both to them and to yourself that you are not willing to participate in dysfunction disguised as love. Eventually, when a narcissist realizes that their usual strategies no longer work, that your boundaries are real, not rhetorical, they are forced to confront a reality they've spent their lives avoiding. That control is not love, and dominance is not intimacy. And that confrontation, while deeply uncomfortable for them, is also the seed of whatever genuine transformation might one day become possible. Whether or not they ever get there is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to live in truth.